Hello and a very warm welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight we journey back in time, not to the romanticized Highlands of sweeping epics and noble warriors, but to the stark, unforgiving, and often brutal reality of medieval Scotland. We will set aside the myths to explore the cold, hard truths of an existence defined by a relentless struggle against the land, the elements, and each other. Before we venture into the cold mists of medieval Scotland, a simple gesture can help our small beacon of history shine a little brighter. If you find a sense of peace in these historical drifts, a quiet subscribe and a thoughtful like are always deeply appreciated, but only, of course, if this is a journey you truly enjoy. It's always a pleasure to know who is listening in the quiet hours, so feel free to share where in the world you are settling in from tonight. Now dim the lights, settle into your bed, and let the comfort of your surroundings envelop you. Take a slow, deep breath and allow your mind to drift away from the present and into the past, to the craggy mountains and misty glens of a Scotland long gone. Imagine for a moment that your life is not measured in decades of relative comfort and security, but in a handful of years defined by unceasing toil. Imagine that the world beyond your small, smoky village is a place of profound danger, where the specters of famine, plague, and war are not abstract historical concepts, but intimate, ever-present companions. This was the universal truth for the vast majority of people living in medieval Scotland. Whether you were a lowly peasant, a tenant farmer bound to the soil, or even a clansman caught in the endless power struggles of chiefs and kings, life was invariably short, relentlessly harsh, and often brutally concluded. There was no safety net, no social welfare, no guarantee that the sun rising on your meager fields would not be the last you would see. Existence was a constant grinding battle for survival. It was a war waged on multiple fronts against forces both seen and unseen. You fought against the unforgiving elements, the biting winds that swept down from the Highlands, the relentless rains that could turn fields into quagmires and rot crops in the ground, and the deep penetrating cold of winter that seeped into your very bones. There was no central heating, no reassuring weather app on a glowing screen, only the damp chill of a stone and turf hovel, and the hope that your meager supply of peat would last until spring. You fought against the land itself, a thin, rocky, acidic soil that begrudgingly yielded its sustenance. And you fought against the arbitrary whims of your overlords, the clan chiefs and feudal lairds, who held the power of life and death over you and your family. Their demands were absolute, their justice swift and often merciless. And then there were the more visceral threats. The threat of rampant, incurable disease, which could sweep through a community like a phantom, leaving devastation in its wake. The threat of rival families and warring clans whose ancient feuds and sudden violent raids could shatter the fragile peace of your world in an instant. And always looming on the horizon like a permanent dark cloud was the threat of the English. The great, powerful kingdom to the south, with its seemingly endless appetite for conquest, cast a long and terrifying shadow over the very notion of a Scottish identity. For the common person, these were not matters of high politics or grand strategy. They were the terrifying immediate realities that framed every single day of their precarious existence. This was a world where survival was the only true victory, a daily achievement in a life of pervasive hardship. From this landscape of pervasive struggle, there was no childhood as you might understand it. The concept of a protected, innocent period of play and learning was a luxury afforded to almost no one. From the moment you were old enough to walk steadily on your own 2 feet, you were put to work. There were no nursery rhymes, no brightly colored toys, only the endless expanse of the fields and the demanding presence of livestock. Your small hands, still learning their own dexterity, were tasked with scattering seeds, pulling weeds, or keeping a watchful eye on the precious few chickens or a solitary pig. You learned very early, with the silent, irrefutable logic of your world, that your purpose was to toil. You worked from the first gray light of dawn until the last vestiges of the sun disappeared behind the hills, your small body aching with a weariness that would become your life's most constant companion. The notion of rising above your station was a fantasy as distant and unattainable as the stars. Your lot was to serve the needs of your lord and master, to work his land and contribute your small part to a system that gave you almost nothing in return. As you grew older, the work did not ease. It simply became harder, more demanding, and significantly more dangerous. For the men, life was a slow and steady breaking of the body. You would spend interminable hours behind a clumsy, heavy wooden plow, its single blade barely scratching a furrow into the thin, stony soil. Often, you would be yoked to this contraption alongside an ox, both of you straining against the unyielding earth, your muscles burning, your sweat mingling with the damp Scottish air. When not plowing, you were herding sheep across the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the hills and glens, constantly vigilant for predators, or the sudden shifts in weather that could trap you miles from shelter. Or perhaps you were out on the moors cutting peat with a heavy, sharp spade. This was vital work, as peat was the primary fuel for warmth and cooking, but it was back-breaking labor performed in all weathers, leaving your hands raw and your back screaming in protest. The women of the community bore a particularly heavy double burden. They were expected to work alongside their husbands and fathers in the fields, sharing in the planting, weeding, and harvesting. Yet their labor did not end when they left the fields. They returned to the hovel to care for large families, to grind the oats, to cook the meager meals, to fetch water, and to tend to the endless cycle of life and death that played out within their small homes. This was often done while pregnant or nursing an infant, a state of near constant reality for many women. Imagine her hands perpetually chapped and raw from the frigid morning air, and the harsh lye soap, her body never fully recovering from one childbirth before the next began. For those unfortunate enough to work in the nascent mining and quarrying industries, the toil was of a different, more terrifying kind. You would descend into dark, damp, and unstable tunnels, hacking away at the earth with crude hand tools, the air thick with coal dust. You would haul heavy loads of coal or stone to the surface, your lungs slowly, ineluctably filling with the black dust that would one day suffocate you from the inside. The dangers were immediate and horrific. The sudden thunderous collapse of a tunnel, a pocket of trapped gas igniting in a fiery explosion, or the slow, creeping death of what would later be known as black lung disease. This wasn't a job. It was a sentence. At the end of a long day of such relentless labor, the concept of returning home offered little in the way of modern comfort. Your home was not a sanctuary of privacy and warmth, but a cramped, smoky hovel, often consisting of just a single room. The walls were likely made of wattle and daub, a lattice of woven branches packed with mud, straw, and animal dung, or rough, unmortared stone. The roof, a thatch of heather or turf, was in a constant state of slow decay, prone to leaks that turned the packed earth floor into a muddy slick. A central fire pit with no chimney provided the only source of heat and light. Its smoke filled the small space, stinging your eyes and blackening the rafters, a constant acrid presence in the air you breathed. And you were not alone in this space. During the bitter Scottish winters, it was common practice to bring the livestock inside with you. Your cow, your few sheep. These were your roommates, their body heat, a precious shared commodity to conserve warmth against the biting cold. The pungent, earthy smell of the animals, mingled with the thick wood smoke and the dampness of the earth, was the permanent atmosphere of your domestic life. Your sustenance, the reward for your back-breaking toil, was as meager as your dwelling. The Scottish diet was a monotonous affair dictated by what the thin, acidic soil could be coaxed to produce. The staples were oats and barley. Oats in particular were the bedrock of your diet. They would be pounded into a coarse meal, a gritty flour used to make bannocks, a type of hard, flat, unleavened bread cooked on a hot stone or griddle over the fire. More often, the oats were boiled with water to create a thick porridge. This was the meal you ate day in and day out. It was bland. It was often gritty from the millstones, but it filled an empty belly and provided the raw fuel needed for another day's labor. Even the better grains you grew, like barley and rye, were not truly yours. A significant portion of your entire harvest was owed to your landlord as rent and to the church as a tithe. What remained for your family was precious little. If you were lucky, you might have enough barley to brew a weak, cloudy ale. This wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. The local water sources, streams, wells, or locks, were often peaty and unclean, carrying the risk of dysentery and other waterborne illnesses. The weak ale, having been boiled in the brewing process, was often the safest thing to drink. As for meat, that was a luxury so rare as to be almost mythical, an occasional scrap from the Lord's table, a bit of salted fish. If you lived near the coast and were exceptionally fortunate, or perhaps a small bird snared in the woods, these were fleeting moments of flavor in a lifetime of blandness. This meager existence was perched on a knife's edge. Hunger was not an occasional discomfort. It was a constant companion, a gnawing presence in the pit of your stomach. And when the harvest failed, or when marauding armies swept through the glens, that constant hunger could quickly descend into full-blown starvation. In these dire periods, chronicles from the time paint a truly harrowing picture. People were reduced to eating grass, chewing on tree bark, or even scooping up dirt in a desperate attempt to stave off the inevitable. Their bodies would waste away, their skin stretched tight over their bones. The historian John Barber, writing of the great famine that struck between 1315 and 1317, described how relentless rains rotted the crops in the fields before they could be harvested. The desperate poor perished en masse, first eating their horses and draft animals, and then with nothing left, simply succumbing to the all-consuming void of starvation. Lurking in the shadows of this world of hunger and toil was the ever-present specter of disease. In an age before the understanding of germs, before antibiotics or vaccines, even the most seemingly minor ailment could escalate into a fatal condition. Life was a lottery, and the odds were not in your favor. Epidemics were a terrifying and recurring feature of life, sweeping through the fetid, overcrowded conditions of villages and hamlets like wildfire. Smallpox, typhoid, dysentery, and tuberculosis were names whispered with dread, their arrival heralding a period of widespread, indiscriminate devastation. A simple cut or scratch sustained while working in the fields or mending a fence could become infected. With no effective way to treat it, septicemia blood poisoning would set in a common and terrifying killer that brought fever agony and a slow, certain death. In the face of such relentless medical threats, your options were profoundly limited. The sophisticated knowledge of a learned physician was a privilege reserved for the wealthiest nobility. For a common peasant, your first and perhaps only recourse was a local folk healer, often an elderly woman who possessed a deep but unscientific knowledge of herbal remedies passed down through generations. She might offer a poultice of herbs for a wound, or a bitter tea for a fever. While sometimes effective, these remedies were powerless against the major infectious diseases. Your other option was the church. A local cleric or a monk from a nearby monastery might have some rudimentary medical knowledge gleaned from ancient Latin texts, but their treatments often involved a mixture of prayer bleeding and questionable concoctions. The barber surgeon, a figure who combined the trades of haircutting and minor surgery, offered a more hands-on but equally terrifying service lancing boils or even amputating limbs with unsterilized tools and no anesthetic. This precarious state of health meant that life was tragically short. Infant mortality was a heartbreakingly common reality. It is estimated that over half of all babies born in medieval Scotland never reached their 5th birthday. The sound of a grieving mother's wail burying yet another tiny wasted body in the cold earth of the churchyard was a familiar and sorrowful part of the village soundscape. Childbirth itself was a perilous event for the mother. With no modern obstetric care, complications that are now routine could be fatal, and many women died in the process of giving life, leaving behind a bereft husband and a gaggle of motherless children. Fathers, too, were often cut down in their prime by a sudden injury or a swift illness, leaving their families vulnerable, destitute, and without their primary provider of labor and protection. If you, as a peasant child, managed to survive the gauntlet of infectious diseases and the constant threat of malnutrition, your life expectancy was still shockingly brief by modern standards. You might expect to live to be just 30 years old, a life of 3 short decades filled with unceasing labor, constant hunger, and the ever-present threat of a painful death. It was a short, bleak, and arduous existence. And for those afflicted with certain incurable diseases, life became a living hell. Leprosy, a disease that caused grotesque disfigurement and the slow rotting away of flesh, was particularly feared. Those who contracted it were declared legally dead and cruelly cast out from their communities. They were forced to live as outcasts, wearing bells to warn others of their approach, their faces and limbs gradually decaying as they fended for themselves in the wilderness, utterly alone. Beyond the daily existential war waged against hunger, disease, and the elements, there existed another entirely man-made layer of hardship. This was the relentless oppression of the feudal system, a rigid social hierarchy that was as unyielding as the granite of the Highlands. As a peasant farmer, you were bound by a complex web of harsh obligations. The land you worked was not your own. You owed a significant portion of everything you managed to coax from the earth to the local lord as rent. This was not a simple financial transaction. It was a transfer of your very life's energy. The best of your grain, the fattest of your livestock, the finest of your produce, all were destined for the lord's storehouses, not your family's bellies. The nobility, insulated by their stone castles and their sense of divine right, saw no shame in, as the saying went, wringing all they could from their tenants, leaving you and your family with just enough to scrape by, and often not even that. Your existence was profoundly precarious. Many peasants were classified as tenants at will, a designation that hung over your head like a sharpened axe. It meant that your right to live on and work your small patch of land was entirely at the whim of your landlord. He could raise your rent without warning or reason, demanding a larger share of a harvest that was already stretched to its limits. Worse, he could evict you and your entire family on a moment's notice. Perhaps he decided that raising sheep for the lucrative wool trade was more profitable than having human tenants. With a single cold command, you could be cast out your hovel, torn down your family, left homeless and destitute with nowhere to go. This constant threat of displacement created a deep-seated anxiety, a knowledge that the very ground beneath your feet was not your own. Lower still in this unforgiving social order were the cotters. These were the landless laborers, the poorest of the poor. They owned no tenancy, not even a precarious one. They survived by hiring themselves out for mere sustenance, toiling in the fields of richer peasants, or performing the most menial tasks as servants in the halls of clan chiefs. Theirs was a hand-to-mouth existence, a life of absolute dependency on the scraps offered by others. And for everyone in the peasant class, from the tenant at will to the cotter, absolute obedience to your clan chief and the noble lords was not a matter of choice. It was a condition of survival, an expectation backed by the ever-present threat of swift and brutal punishment. To step out of line, to question your betters, or to fail in your duties was to risk a severe beating, a public maiming, or worse. The work of your hands and the fruits of your labor were never truly your own. They were subject to the absolute will of those above you. This oppressive system permeated every aspect of your life, even the most personal. Marriage was rarely a matter of the heart. It was a practical arrangement for survival and for those with anything to offer, a tool for building alliances. A woman's wedding day, far from being a romantic fantasy, was likely the only time in her life she would ever wear shoes. Not delicate slippers, but a rough pair made of stiff cowhide, a practical gift for a life of hard walking. Children were both a blessing and a burden. On one hand, they were more hungry mouths to feed, stretching your meager resources even thinner. On the other, they were more hands to work the fields, and a potential source of security in your old age should you live to see it. Sons were especially prized for their potential to wield a sword and defend the clan's honor, while daughters were often married off in their early teens to seal an agreement or strengthen an alliance with a neighboring family. Life under the thumb of a feudal lord was oppressive enough, but for many in medieval Scotland, particularly in the Highlands, there was another layer of constant, violent threat clan warfare. Your village might be nominally at peace with the king in Edinburgh, but that offered little comfort if you were caught in the crossfire of a generations-old feud between your clan and a rival one. For the common people, this meant life was a constant, nerve-wracking struggle for survival. At any moment, with little or no warning, a rival clan could descend upon your village in a whirlwind of violence and destruction. These were not formal battles fought on designated fields. They were brutal, lightning-fast raids designed to inflict maximum damage and terror. The consequences of such a raid were devastating. The raiders would sweep through, setting fire to the thatched roofs of your hovels and burning the precious crops in the fields just as they were ready for harvest. They would drive off your cattle, the most valuable and mobile form of wealth in the Highlands, leaving you bereft of your most important asset. And they would leave a trail of death and destruction in their wake, cutting down any who dared to resist. Families lived in a state of perpetual fear, a low-grade constant anxiety that permeated their daily lives. You never knew when the next raid might come, when the next reprisal for some long-forgotten slight might be exacted upon you and your neighbors. This reality forced a state of hypervigilance and preparedness. The men of the clan did not simply work the fields. They worked them with a sword and a dirk, a long single-edged dagger always close at hand. They had to be ready to drop their scythes and rally to their clan chief's banner at a moment's notice, summoned by a runner or the distant urgent sound of a horn. The women and children, meanwhile, learned to keep a sharp lookout. their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for the first sign of approaching danger. They had to be prepared to flee at a moment's notice, grabbing what little they could carry and running for the relative safety of a nearby peel tower. These were simple crumbling stone structures, often little more than lookout posts, but they offered a refuge of last resort. Families would huddle inside with perhaps a small sack of oats and some smoked herring, besieged by a vengeful rival clan, waiting and praying for the danger to pass. Even the silence of the night offered no true respite. Highlanders learned to sleep with one ear open, ever alert for the warning blare of a cow horn echoing through the glen or the sound of the dreaded battle cry, Groom Dop, a Gaelic phrase meaning, get ready for a fight. This relentless cycle of raid and counter-raid, of feud and bloody vendetta, was not an occasional disruption. It was a fundamental part of life in the Highlands for centuries. It was as much a feature of the landscape as the craggy mountains and the misty lochs. And when the conflicts escalated beyond simple raids, such as during rebellions against the crown, the common folk suffered immensely. If they were suspected of aiding the rebels' royal forces, or their clan allies would show no mercy. Their crops would be burned, their livestock seized, and their homes torched, leaving them with absolutely nothing. This was a world where peace was a fleeting, precious interlude in a near-constant state of low-level warfare, a life lived forever under the shadow of violence. It is a testament to the human spirit that even in the midst of such pervasive hardship, suffering, and violence, life was not an unbroken tableau of misery. The people of medieval Scotland, downtrodden and oppressed, as they were still found moments of joy, connection, and profound meaning. These glimmers of light were not grand or dramatic. They were small, precious embers glowing in the darkness, all the more cherished for the cold that surrounded them. They celebrated the great turning points of the agricultural year, the planting in the spring, the harvest in the autumn with festivals and feasts. These were not lavish affairs, but communal gatherings where what little food and drink was available could be shared. Under the vast, starry sky, far from the choking smoke of the hovels, they would dance to the wild, mournful music of fiddles and the skirling, defiant sound of the pipes. In the long, dark winter evenings, gathered around the flickering light of the central hearth, they would share stories. This was the lifeblood of their culture, the way they made sense of their world and their place in it. They passed down the ancient legends of heroes and warriors, the mythic tales of their ancestors, and the traditions that bound them together as a people. They sang songs of love and loss, of epic battles and quiet sorrows, their voices weaving a tapestry of shared experience that connected them to generations past and future. They also clung fiercely to their faith. While the institutional church could be an oppressive force demanding heavy tithes and strict obedience, the rituals and teachings it offered provided a deep well of solace. In a world that so often seemed random and cruel, the promise of an afterlife, the structure of the sacraments, and the intercession of the saints offered a framework for understanding their suffering and a hope for ultimate redemption. In the face of constant threats, they leaned on each other. The bonds of kinship and community forged in the crucible of shared hardship were incredibly strong. Your neighbors were not just people who lived nearby. They were your allies, your support system, the people you relied on to help you rebuild after a raid, or to share a handful of oats during a lean winter. This powerful sense of community was the bedrock that sustained them through the darkest of times. And from this bedrock, flickers of resilience and even quiet defiance would emerge. While they might be subjugated by their lords, the peasantry clung fiercely to their own customs and folkways. The Gaelic rhythms of their language and their songs ordered their harsh days, creating a cultural space that was uniquely their own, a world the Anglophone feudal lords could not fully penetrate. They performed ancient sowing songs as they cast their seeds upon the fields, the melodies carrying a hope for a bountiful harvest. They chanted prayers for protection, not just from the devil, but from the more immediate and tangible threats of the fairies and spirits they believed stalked the misty moors and lonely places. These were the Sith, the fairy folk who could bless or curse steal children or lead travelers astray. And in the quiet corners of the hovel, they would whisper the prophecies attributed to figures like True Thomas the Rhymer. These were cryptic, powerful verses that often spoke of a world turned upside down, a distant future day when the low would be raised up and the high laid low. For a people with no political power and little hope of earthly justice, these prophecies offered a potent, if distant, promise of cosmic retribution, a belief that one day their suffering would be vindicated. It was a form of hope, a long patient and deeply held conviction that their endurance was not in vain. That profound sense of kinship and community we just touched upon was not merely an abstract feeling or a loose association of neighbors. In medieval Scotland, especially in the Gaelic-speaking Highlands, it was codified into the single most powerful and pervasive social structure of the age, the clan system. This system was the true scaffolding of society, a framework that dictated everything from your personal identity to your ultimate allegiance. To understand medieval Scotland is to understand the deep, unbreakable, and often violent bonds of the clan. The nation itself was a complex, shifting patchwork of these fiercely independent groups, each loyal to its own kin, each with its own territory, its own history, and its own enemies. The very word clan comes from the Gaelic term clan, which literally means children. This is the key to understanding the entire concept. A clan was not just a tribe or a political faction. It was envisioned as a single enormous extended family. All members, from the highest-ranking gentleman to the lowliest cotter, claimed descent from a common, often legendary ancestor. You were a child of that ancestor, and every other member of the clan was your kin, your blood, your family. This bond provided a powerful sense of identity protection and a crucial feeling of belonging in a world where the formal rule of law emanating from a distant king was often tenuous at best. Your clan was your nation in miniature. This sense of belonging was absolute, and the loyalty it demanded was paramount. In the hierarchy of your obligations, your clan came first. Loyalty to your chief often trumped any theoretical allegiance you owed to the king in Stirling or Edinburgh. The bonds of blood and kinship were the primary sinews that held your world together, and they were far more immediate and powerful than the abstract notion of a unified Scottish state. Your word, your oath to your chief and your kinsmen, was your bond. To break that oath, to betray your clan, was the most profound shame imaginable. It was a social and spiritual death sentence, an act that would make you an outcast, a Duin Gun Clew, a man without honor. The punishment was not just scorn, but exile, or even death, for you had severed the one tie that gave your life meaning and protection. In this world, your identity was not primarily Scottish. You were a MacDonald, a Campbell, a MacLeod, a Grant, a Gordon. That name told everyone who you were, where you came from, and who you would fight and die for. It was your lineage, your inheritance, and your destiny all wrapped up in a single word. In the chaotic and often violent landscape of medieval Scotland, your clan was your shield. It was the source of justice, the organizer of defense, and the provider of aid in times of famine. It was a self-contained universe, and its rules, its traditions, and its feuds were the forces that truly governed your life. At the head of this sprawling, powerful family, the clan stood its undisputed leader, the chief. In Gaelic, he was the Cian Tyned, the head of the kin, a title that barely scratches the surface of his immense authority. To his people, he was a quasi-monarchical figure, a man to be both revered and profoundly feared. He was not merely a landlord or a military commander. He was the living embodiment of the clan itself, the focal point of all loyalty, tradition, and power. Imagine yourself a humble tenant farmer standing in his presence. The chief was your warlord, your judge, and in a strange, demanding way, your father figure all rolled into one formidable person. His primary responsibility in the most fundamental sense was the welfare and protection of his people. This was a paternalistic duty, but one rooted in harsh pragmatism. A strong clan needed strong clansmen. Therefore, he was responsible for settling disputes between families, ensuring a rough and ready form of justice was meted out. If your neighbor stole one of your sheep, you did not write a letter to a distant magistrate in Edinburgh. You brought your grievance before the chief, and his word was the absolute final law on the matter. There was no appeal. He was also the warlord, the man who led his warriors into battle. Whether it was a defensive action against a rival clan's raid or an offensive creech, a cattle raid to enrich the clan and settle old scores, he was at the forefront, and you were expected to follow without question. The immense power of the chiefship was not always a simple matter of inheritance. While it usually passed through the male line to the eldest son, a more ancient Celtic system known as tanistry often prevailed. Under this system, the successor or tanist was chosen during the current chief's lifetime. He was typically a close male relative, a brother, a cousin, a nephew selected not just for his bloodline, but for his proven ability as a warrior and a leader. This was a practical adaptation to a violent world. A clan could not afford to be led by a weak or foolish heir. There were even rare, notable exceptions to the patriarchal rule. The MacLeods of Dunvegan, for instance, famously traced their lineage through daughters for several generations, a remarkable anomaly in a deeply male-dominated society. For the high-ranking sons of a chief who were not destined to inherit the leadership, another path to immense prestige and power lay within the church. A nobleman might secure the position of bishop or abbot for his son. These were not merely spiritual roles. They were positions of immense secular authority. A powerful bishop controlled vast estates, raised his own armies from the church's tenants, levied taxes, and dispensed justice in his own courts. These men often acted as key diplomats and power brokers, navigating the treacherous currents of alliances between clans and the royal court. A great chief was also expected to be a patron of Gaelic culture. In the great hall of his castle, he supported craftsmen of all kinds. Weavers who produced the intricate, colorful tartans that distinguished his clan. Armorers who forged the gleaming steel of swords and dirks. Silversmiths who crafted the unique, ornate brooches that were a symbol of status and identity. And most importantly, he was a patron of the arts. He would retain a bard, a professional poet, who would declaim heroic verses in the old style, reciting the clan's genealogy and celebrating its triumphs in battle. These recitations were often accompanied by the haunting, enchanting notes of the clarsach, the Gaelic wire-strung harp, its music echoing through the smoky hall. But behind this veneer of culture and patronage, the chief had to be a master politician, endlessly scheming and jockeying for position in the tangled web of Highland politics. He had to win the favor of the great regional magnates like the Lord of the Isles or the Earls of Moray, and navigate his relationship with the ever-encroaching Stuart kings. Only the strong and the cunning survived. The weak were consumed. The clan, in truth, was not a homogeneous mass of people answering to a single leader. It was a complex living organism with its own internal skeleton, a finely tiered hierarchy that mirrored the feudal structures of the lowlands, but with a uniquely Gaelic character. The clan itself was often divided into major septs and branches, cadet houses founded by the younger sons of past chiefs, each with their own captain and a distinct though subordinate identity. Beneath the chief was a class of gentry known as the Dawen Uile, which translates simply to the noble people. These were the chief's immediate kinsmen, his lieutenants and officers. From this class came the tacksman, a crucial role in the clan's economy. A tacksman leased a large portion of clan land, a tack, directly from the chief, and then sublet smaller plots to the common clansmen. He was a middle manager, a rent collector, and a military officer responsible for mustering the fighting men from his area when the chief called. And the chief always called. Your service in this feudal order was absolute. It was considered your paramount duty, a sacred obligation that superseded anything you might owe to the distant church or the even more distant state. This service was rendered in two primary forms. The first was tribute. You paid your rent to the tacksman or chief, not in coin, which was scarce, but in kind. A portion of your grain harvest, a calf from your small herd, a number of man-days of labor on the chief's own farm. This was the price of your tenancy and your protection. The second and more critical form of service was military. When the horn sounded, you mustered. You left your plow in the furrow, took up your sword and targ, and joined the ranks of your kinsmen ready to march. For a young warrior steeped from birth in the heroic ethos of Gaelic war poetry and clan law, the prospect of a glorious death in service to your kin and ancestral honor was the highest possible aspiration. The bards sang not of long, peaceful lives, but of valiant last stands of warriors who sold their lives dearly to protect the clan's honor. To die in your bed was unremarkable. To die on the field of battle surrounded by your enemies was to achieve a form of immortality, to become a story that would be told around the hearth for generations. This cultural value system meant that by sheer necessity, each clan operated as a miniature martial state perpetually on a war footing. From an early age, boys were trained not for a trade, but for war. They learned to handle the dirk, the bow, and the broadsword. They practiced wrestling and running, hardening their bodies for the rigors of a Highland charge. Every able-bodied man was a soldier first and a farmer or herdsman second. This constant state of military readiness was essential for survival. This was a culture of hypervigilance and ingrained militancy, and it arose directly from the brutal realities of Highland geography and politics. The clan lands were remote, rugged, and thinly populated patchworks of mist-shrouded glens, isolated lochs, and steep mountains. Borders were not neat lines on a map. They were fluid, contested territories, constantly in flux, amidst the churn of raids and feuds. The most common expression of this militancy was the cattle raid known as the Creech. This was far more than simple theft. It was a revered social and economic institution. For young men, it was a vital rite of passage, a way to prove their courage and warrior skill. For the clan, it was a way to pay back affronts to its honor, to weaken a rival, and quite frankly, to provide a much-needed infusion of protein and wealth in lean times. This relentless culture of raiding and warfare, fueled by an intricate code of honor and vengeance, meant that countless feuds, both large and small, convulsed the Highlands, some dragging on for generations in a relentless cycle of retribution. In such a world, strength was the only currency that mattered. Woe to the clan that failed to protect its own. But this fierce loyalty, this all-encompassing sense of kinship that provided so much identity and protection, had a dark and destructive mirror image. The same fire that warmed the hearth of the clan could just as easily become a raging inferno, consuming everything in its path. The dark side of clan loyalty was the blood feud, a perceived slight to a clan's honor, a dispute over a few acres of rocky pasture or the theft of a single cow was not a matter for courts or arbitration. It was a personal collective wound to the entire family. An insult to one was an insult to all, and the only acceptable response was vengeance. This code could ignite a blaze of retribution that would not be extinguished for generations, passing from father to son like a cursed inheritance. It was a poison that seeped into the very soil of the Highlands, a legacy written not in ink, but in blood. Nowhere is this tragic legacy more vividly illustrated than in the bitter, centuries-long hatred between Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald, two of the most powerful and influential families in the west of Scotland. Their rivalry became the stuff of dark legend, an epic of animosity that spanned centuries and was punctuated by acts of unspeakable brutality. To understand this feud is to understand the very engine of Highland conflict. It was not a simple disagreement. It was a fundamental clash of ambition, territory, and identity that festered over time into a pathological hatred. The seeds of this infamous rivalry were sown in the early 14th century during the tumultuous Wars of Independence. In the complex struggle for the Scottish throne, the MacDonalds had initially backed the rivals of Robert the Bruce. The Campbells, conversely, were among Bruce's most loyal and steadfast supporters. When Bruce finally secured his crown, he rewarded his friends and punished his enemies. In a fateful decision, he granted the ancient Lordship of Lorne, a vast and strategic territory in Argyll, to his loyal Campbell followers. The problem was that the MacDonalds considered these lands their own ancestral territory. In their eyes, this was not a legitimate act of a king. It was a grave injustice, a theft of their birthright, and a profound and unforgivable affront. From the Campbell perspective, it was a just reward for their loyalty and sacrifice in the cause of Scotland's freedom. From the MacDonald perspective, it was a poisoned gift, an act of royal favoritism that planted a rival power squarely in their heartlands. A deep and festering wound was opened, and it would never truly heal. From this single contested parcel of land, a forest of bloodshed would grow. The initial grievance over territory quickly metastasized into a cycle of escalating violence. The two clans, now neighbors, were locked in a perpetual struggle for dominance. Raids on cattle became skirmishes. Skirmishes became pitched battles, and battles led to massacres. The hatred became ingrained in their very identities. It was a hatred nursed by mother's milk and reinforced by the songs of the bards. It was a rivalry that would simmer and boil over time and again, escalating into open warfare, the burning of villages, and the brutal slaughter of rivals, culminating in acts of such shocking treachery that they would stain the honor of Scotland for centuries to come. The simmering hatred between the Campbells and MacDonalds, nurtured over centuries of raids, skirmishes, and land disputes, was destined to erupt into moments of such singular, infamous violence that they would become permanent scars on the Scottish psyche. The most notorious of these episodes, a name that still resonates with a chilling echo of treachery, is the Massacre of Glencoe. The event took place in the bleak midwinter of 1692. It was not a battle fought between two armies on an open field. It was something far more insidious. On the orders of the government in Edinburgh, a company of soldiers led by Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon was sent to be quartered in the homes of the MacDonalds of Glencoe. Imagine the scene. A remote, snow-dusted glen sealed off from the world by steep mountains. The MacDonalds, as was their duty under the sacred Highland code of hospitality, opened their homes to the soldiers. For nearly 2 weeks they lived side by side. They shared what little food they had. They drank ale together, they played cards, and they told stories by the fire. The soldiers were guests, and the MacDonalds were their hosts. But the Campbell-led troops were not there on a mission of peace. They were carrying secret orders from the government to put all to the sword under 70, a command for the complete extermination of the Glencoe MacDonalds, who had been slow to swear a new oath of allegiance to King William. In the pre-dawn hours of February 13th, the order was carried out. The quiet of the glen was shattered by the crack of muskets and the screams of the betrayed. The soldiers turned on their hosts, murdering them as they slept in their beds or as they scrambled from their homes into the freezing darkness. The clan chief MacIain was shot and killed as he was getting dressed. In total, 38 men, women, and children were murdered in the initial attack. Many more, perhaps hundreds, fled into the blizzard-swept mountains, where most would perish from exposure and starvation in the unforgiving winter landscape. The crime of Glencoe was not simply its brutality. It was the shocking breach of trust, the violation of the most sacred of Highland codes. It cemented the hatred between the two clans for generations, and became a dark symbol of government treachery and the brutal realities of clan politics. Lest you think Glencoe was an isolated act of singular cruelty, another even bloodier chapter in this saga had been written nearly half a century earlier in 1646. At Dunaverty Castle, perched on a dramatic cliffside in Kintyre, some 300 MacDonalds men, women, and children had taken refuge from a besieging Campbell army. The Campbells laid siege to the castle, cutting off its water supply. After several days, parched and desperate, the MacDonalds surrendered. They did so expecting to be granted quarter, the customary mercy shown to a defeated enemy who lays down their arms. But they were shown no mercy. On the orders of the Campbell commanders, the surrendered MacDonald men were systematically executed. In a shocking act of calculated slaughter, they were taken one by one and killed their mutilated bodies, then thrown from the high cliffs into the sea below. This treacherous massacre at Dunaverty was a stark reminder that in the calculus of a blood feud, even the supposed rules of war could be discarded in favor of total annihilation. And this bitter, violent enmity between the Campbells and the MacDonalds was by no means unique. Across the Highlands and Islands, other fierce rivalries simmered and boiled over. The Mackenzies and the MacLeods were locked in a long and bloody struggle for dominance in the north. The Grants and the Gordons clashed repeatedly over lands and influence in the northeast. And perhaps most famously, the landless, outlawed Clan MacGregor waged a desperate and brutal war of survival against their powerful neighbors, the Colquhouns. The landscape of medieval Scotland was crisscrossed with these invisible lines of hatred, a tangled web of ancient grudges and inherited vengeance that ensured peace was always a fragile and temporary state. It would be tempting to imagine this map of Highland hatreds as a fixed and permanent thing, a landscape of immutable enmities carved in stone. But the reality of clan politics was far more fluid, more treacherous, and ultimately more pragmatic than that. Despite the generations-old blood feuds that ran like deep poisoned rivers through the social fabric, clans occasionally found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with their most hated rivals. A clan's bitterest enemy one year could, through a sudden shift in the political winds, become their most vital and necessary ally the next. This was the intricate, often bewildering dance of survival. The driving force was almost always the appearance of a mutual and more pressing foe. When a truly powerful threat emerged, a rival clan growing too dominant, or the heavy hand of the crown itself, even the most deep-seated grudges could be temporarily set aside in the name of self-preservation. This Byzantine web of shifting alliances and sudden betrayals highlights a core truth of the Highland world. The bonds of clan loyalty, while seemingly absolute, were ultimately the only constant you could rely on in a brutal and precarious existence. All other allegiances were temporary and transactional. You might join with the Mackenzies to raid the Grants one season, only to find yourself allied with the Grants against the Mackenzies the next, all depending on a complex calculus of power, opportunity, and survival. It was a political landscape with no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, only permanent interests, the interest of your clan. And observing this chaotic internecine warfare from the relative safety of their lowland courts were the Stuart kings. They were not passive spectators. On the contrary, they were often masterful, if cynical, conductors of this orchestra of violence. The kings in Edinburgh, and later the joint monarchs in London, were all too happy to exploit these clan rivalries for their own strategic ends. Their ultimate goal was to assert royal authority over the fiercely independent and notoriously ungovernable Highlands. Their primary method was the age-old strategy of divide and conquer. They understood that a Highlands united against them was a formidable threat. A Highlands divided and consumed by its own internal feuds was manageable. So they meddled. They played favorites. A king might bestow a title, a charter for land, or a lucrative trade monopoly on a favored chief, deliberately inflaming the jealousies and resentments of his rivals. This royal patronage would empower one clan, which would then act as the crown's enforcer in the region, while simultaneously ensuring that its neighbors were too busy fighting the newly empowered clan to cause trouble for the king. It was a brilliant, deadly game of chess, with the clansmen as unwitting pawns. The most infamous and chilling tool of this royal manipulation was the policy of granting letters of fire and sword. This was not just a metaphorical expression. It was an official legal document, a royal warrant that gave a chosen clan the full authority of the state to attack, dispossess, and slaughter a rival clan with complete impunity. Imagine a chief receiving such a letter. It was a license to commit what would otherwise be considered mass murder, all under the veneer of royal justice. This policy weaponized the existing feuds, pouring the gasoline of state sanction onto the smoldering embers of ancient hatreds. It was the ultimate expression of the crown's cynical strategy, pitting clan against clan, letting them bleed each other dry, all in the name of bringing order to the Highlands. This grander political game also played out on the international stage. As Scotland found itself torn between its Auld alliance with France and the ever-present influence of England clans, would align themselves with pro-French or pro-English factions, turning their local rivalries into proxy wars for the great powers of Europe. If the clan chief was the master of your earthly life, the arbiter of your physical survival, there was another power, a far greater and more pervasive one that claimed absolute dominion over your eternal soul. In medieval Scotland, the Catholic Church was not merely a spiritual institution. It was a colossal force that stood shoulder to shoulder with the great clan chiefs as the most dominant power in the land. Its influence was not confined to the soaring stone cathedrals or the quiet cloisters of a monastery. It reached into every corner of daily life, from the hovel of the lowliest peasant to the great hall of the highest noble. The black-robed clergy were a ubiquitous presence in every town and village, the most visible manifestation of a parallel hierarchy that was often richer, better organized, and ultimately more powerful than the fractious clan system itself. The source of this immense power was simple and absolute. In an age of pervasive disease, casual violence, and brutally short lifespans, the question of what happened after death was not a philosophical musing. It was an urgent, terrifying, and deeply personal concern. The Church held the keys to salvation. It and it alone possessed the divine authority to grant you entrance into the eternal paradise of heaven, or to condemn you to the everlasting torment of hell. This was not an abstract theological concept. The promise of heaven and the threat of hellfire were visceral, immediate realities that dictated behavior, shaped morals, and demanded unquestioning obedience. When your child died of a fever, or your husband was cut down in a raid, the Church's rites were your only comfort, your only hope that their suffering was at an end. And that obedience, that hope for salvation, came at a steep and non-negotiable price. For most Scots, the Church's authority was experienced most directly through a regimen of heavy tithes and offerings. You were compelled by divine law to give a full tenth a tithe of everything you grew, raised, or earned to the Church. Imagine the scene after a full year of backbreaking labor. You finally bring in your meager harvest of oats and barley. Before you can even set aside enough to feed your own family through the winter, the priest or his agent arrives to claim the Church's share. The best sheaves of grain, the strongest calf, a tenth of the wool from your sheep, all of it was taken. This was not a voluntary donation. It was an absolute obligation, and to withhold it was to risk not just earthly punishment, but the damnation of your immortal soul. For a peasantry already living on the knife edge of survival, this tithe was often a ruinous burden. After the Lord had taken his exorbitant rent and the Church had claimed its tenth, you were left with the barest of scraps, precious little to see your family through the long, lean months of winter. You were being squeezed from both sides by the temporal power of the laird and the spiritual power of the priest. This system ensured that the Church grew fantastically wealthy on the backs of the poor. Its grip extended into every aspect of personal life. Marriage was a sacrament strictly controlled by the clergy. They could grant or withhold their blessing at will, and their complex rules regarding kinship and affinity could be used as a political tool to approve or deny alliances. Divorce was all but impossible, and those who dared to defy the Church's teachings on matters of morality and chastity risked public shaming penance or the ultimate spiritual sanction, excommunication, which cast you out from the community of the faithful and effectively condemned you in the eyes of your neighbors. As the Church's power and wealth grew, so too did its anxieties. The specter of witchcraft and heresy began to loom ever larger in the popular and ecclesiastical imagination. The devil, it was believed, was not merely a distant tempter, but an active, insidious force in the world, constantly seeking to corrupt the souls of the faithful and recruit minions for his infernal army. And so the Church took an increasingly active and ultimately horrifying role in rooting out and punishing those suspected of trafficking with the devil. Witch hunts became a regular and terrifying feature of Scottish life, particularly as the religious fervor of the late medieval period bled into the tumultuous era of the Reformation in the 16th and 17th centuries. An atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion settled over the land where a personal grudge, a jealous whisper, or a simple misunderstanding could have fatal consequences. Imagine you are a woman living in a small village. Perhaps you live alone, a widow with a sharp tongue. Perhaps you have a knowledge of herbs and folk remedies, and your neighbors sometimes seek your help for minor ailments. One day, a neighbor's cow sickens and dies, or a child falls ill with a fever that won't break. Suspicion, like a poisonous weed, begins to take root. Whispers turn into accusations, and soon you find yourself dragged before the local church authorities, denounced as a witch. Your pleas of innocence are meaningless. The assumption is not of innocence, but of guilt. The only question is how to extract the confession. The methods used were a litany of calculated cruelty designed to break the body and the will. You might be subjected to sleep deprivation for days on end, pricked with needles to find the devil's mark, an area on the body supposedly impervious to pain. When these psychological torments failed, the interrogators would turn to their gruesome tools. Thumbscrews would be applied to methodically crush your fingers. Heavy iron boots, sometimes filled with boiling oil or water, would be fitted to your legs to inflict unimaginable agony. The infamous Iron Maiden, a coffin-like device studded with interior spikes, was a terrifying instrument of torture and death. Under such duress, a confession was inevitable. People would admit to anything, to flying on broomsticks, to copulating with the devil, to casting malevolent spells simply to make the pain stop. Once the forced confession was secured, the sentence was carried out. The most common fate for a convicted witch was to be strangled and then burned at the stake. This was a public spectacle, a grim piece of religious theater designed to be a terrifying warning to others. Your final moments would be a tableau of public humiliation and agony, your cries echoing across the assembled crowd. Women were especially vulnerable to these zealous inquisitors. In a deeply patriarchal society, any woman who stepped outside the narrow confines of expected female behavior, the healer, the midwife, the woman who lived independently, was an object of suspicion. This virulent misogyny was fanned by the fiery rhetoric of influential preachers like John Knox. While his famous 1558 treatise, The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, was aimed squarely at the Catholic female monarchs of his day, its arguments resonated far more broadly. By railing against the perceived unnaturalness of female authority, Knox and others helped to fuel a social climate in which women were seen as inherently weaker, more irrational, and thus more susceptible to the temptations of the devil. In this poisoned atmosphere, the Church's quest for spiritual purity transformed into a brutal war against its own most vulnerable members, turning neighbor against neighbor and leaving a legacy of thousands of tortured and executed victims. Yet, to paint the medieval church solely with the brush of oppression, greed, and terrifying zeal would be to miss a crucial and more nuanced part of the picture. For all its worldly corruption and brutal excesses, the church in Scotland also offered a measure of genuine comfort, stability, and refuge in an otherwise violent and chaotic world. It was a deeply paradoxical institution capable of both crushing the human spirit and, in its own way, nurturing it. In the turbulent sea of clan warfare and feudal strife, the great abbeys and monasteries were islands of relative peace and order. You need only look at the magnificent ruins that still dot the Scottish landscape today, places like Melrose Jedburgh and Dunfermline, to understand this. these were not mere churches. They were colossal complexes, marvels of medieval engineering and artistry. Their soaring Gothic arches, intricate stone carvings, and vast light-filled naves were a testament not only to the church's immense wealth and sophistication, but also to a vision of permanence and divine order. For a peasant living in a smoky, temporary hovel of mud and turf, the sight of one of these great stone abbeys must have been utterly breathtaking. A vision of heaven on earth, a symbol of something solid and eternal in a life defined by fragility and decay. Within their thick stone walls, a cloistered world of learning and culture managed to flourish, shielded from the relentless violence outside. In the scriptorium, the monastery's writing room monks engaged in the painstaking, patient work of preserving knowledge. Imagine the quiet, focused atmosphere, the scent of beeswax and old parchment, the low hum of chanting from the nearby chapel, the soft rhythmic scratch of a quill on vellum. Here monks meticulously copied not just the sacred texts of the Bible, but also the great works of Greek and Latin antiquity. They chronicled the turbulent events of their own time, becoming the first historians of Scotland. They were the keepers of the guttering flame of learning, painstakingly protecting a legacy of knowledge that would otherwise have been lost in a largely illiterate world. This benevolent role was not limited to the male clergy. In convents scattered across the land, nuns played a vital practical role in caring for the community. They tended to physic gardens, cultivating a vast array of herbs with which they created remedies to nurse the sick. In an age with no real doctors or hospitals, the local convent was often the only source of medical care. The nuns also fed the hungry from their kitchens and offered a safe night's lodging to weary travelers, providing a network of charity and hospitality. Crucially, the church also offered the law of sanctuary. A person fleeing from the law, or more likely from the bloody vengeance of a rival clan, could claim refuge within the consecrated grounds of an abbey or priory. This right was respected by all, a divinely sanctioned time out that often provided the only shield for the weak and dispossessed in the face of relentless feuds and raids. On a more local level, the parish priest was far more than just a tithe collector. He was a central figure in the life of the community, serving as a counselor, a teacher for the few who might learn to read, and a mediator in local disputes. He presided over the great rites of passage that gave life meaning, christening newborn babies, performing marriages, and most importantly, easing the dying into the afterlife with the comfort of the last rites. And for the common folk, the weekly ritual of the Mass offered a moment of transcendence. The soaring Latin hymns, the vibrant colors of the priest's vestments, the sunlight filtering through a stained glass window. All of it was a profound sensory experience, a rare glimpse of beauty and heaven's glory in a life that was otherwise overwhelmingly gray and grim. And yet, this very grandeur, this immense worldly power and opulence, held within it the seeds of its own undoing. It was an institution built on a profound and glaring contradiction. On one hand, it preached the message of a humble carpenter from Galilee, who had warned that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. On the other hand, its highest echelons lived in a state of palatial splendor that would rival any king or clan chief. The great bishops and abbots were not just spiritual leaders, they were feudal lords, political players, and immensely wealthy landowners. They feasted on sumptuous meals, were attended by liveried servants, and engaged in the same ruthless power politics as their secular counterparts. This chasm between the Church's stated ideals and its lived reality did not go unnoticed. For the common peasant forced to give up a tenth of their meager produce, the sight of such clerical decadence must have been a source of deep and festering resentment. Inevitably, this perceived corruption began to spur movements for reform. Whispers of dissent like sparks carried on the wind from mainland Europe began to find fertile soil in Scotland. One of the earliest and most influential of these movements was Lollardy. The Lollards were followers of the English theologian and reformer John Wycliffe. His ideas, articulated in the late 14th century, were radical revolutionary and deeply threatening to the established order of the Catholic Church. Wycliffe argued that the ultimate authority for a Christian was not the Pope in Rome, but the Bible itself. He condemned the Church's vast wealth, the practice of selling indulgences, and the veneration of saints and relics as corrupt and unscriptural. But his most dangerous idea, the one that struck at the very heart of the Church's power, was his insistence that the Bible should be available to everyone in their own language. At the time, Scripture was exclusively in Latin, a language understood only by the highly educated clergy. This gave the Church a complete monopoly on the Word of God. The priest was the indispensable intermediary between God and man. The idea that a common weaver or farmer could read the Gospels for themselves, could form their own relationship with God without the Church's mediation, was profoundly subversive. It threatened to dismantle the entire structure of spiritual authority. Despite the dangers, these Lollard ideas seeped across the border into Scotland, finding a particularly receptive audience in the southwest in the region of Ayrshire. Here, among the merchants and artisans of what became known as the Lollards of Kyle, these calls for reform took root. Imagine the scene: not a public protest, but a clandestine meeting in the back room of a workshop or a quiet corner of a field. A precious hand-copied fragment of Wycliffe's English Bible is passed from hand to hand, read aloud in hushed, reverent tones. This was an act of profound rebellion, and everyone present knew the immense risk they were taking. The Church did not tolerate such heresy. Its response was swift and brutal. Those accused of Lollardy were hunted down, tried, and if they refused to recant, handed over to the secular authorities to be burned at the stake. In 1407, a man named James Resby was executed in Perth for spreading Lollard ideas. In 1433, a Bohemian doctor named Paul Crewar was burned as a heretic in St. Andrews. These fiery executions were meant to be a terrifying deterrent, a clear message of the fate that awaited any who dared to challenge the authority of Rome. Yet the ideas could not be so easily extinguished. Though the Lollard movement was suppressed, it was never entirely wiped out. These early calls for renewal, these acts of quiet defiance, presaged the much greater upheaval that was to come. They were the first tremors of the earthquake that would be the Protestant Reformation, a storm that would ultimately shatter the Church's hegemony over Scotland and reshape the nation forever. Even as the Stuart kings in Edinburgh struggled to assert their authority over a realm of feuding clans and powerful churchmen, the Scottish kingdom remained a deeply fractured entity, a nation divided against itself. Beyond the endless rivalries of MacDonald and Campbell or Grant and Gordon, there existed a far more profound and fundamental chasm, a cultural fault line that ran right through the heart of the country. This was the great Highland-Lowland divide. To the rest of the world, it might have all been Scotland. But to the people living there, the Gaelic-speaking North and the Scots-speaking South were in many ways two different countries inhabited by two different peoples who often viewed each other with a mixture of fear, contempt, and profound misunderstanding. To the lowland Scot, perhaps a prosperous merchant in the bustling port of Leith, a lawyer in the courts of Edinburgh, or a farmer working the fertile fields of the Lothians, The Highlands were a foreign and terrifying wilderness. The people who lived there, the clansmen, were seen as a race apart. They were not fellow Scots. They were wild, uncivilized barbarians living in a state of primitive savagery. The Lowlanders, who saw themselves as part of the wider, more sophisticated European world, looked upon the Highlanders with a deep-seated prejudice, a potent cocktail of scorn and fear. The Highland customs were viewed as bizarre and outlandish. Their dress, the brightly colored tartan plaid and plumed bonnets, was seen as the garb of savages. Their music, the soaring, wailing skirl of the bagpipes, was not considered art, but an uncouth and alien noise. From the lowland perspective, the entire clan system, with its emphasis on kinship and feuding, was a mark of profound backwardness. The cherished Highland practice of the creech, the cattle raid, was not understood as a complex social ritual of honor and retribution. It was seen as simple violent thievery. The clansmen were stereotyped as lazy, treacherous, and incorrigibly violent, a constant threat looming on the northern horizon. Racist tropes abounded in lowland chronicles, and songs depicting Highlanders as little more than primitive thieving savages who needed to be tamed and civilized for their own good. Now imagine yourself on the other side of that divide. You are a clansman living in your misty glen, your life ordered by the ancient rhythms of kinship and the authority of your chief. When you look south towards the lowlands, you see something equally alien and contemptible. You see a people who have sold out. In your eyes, the lowlanders have abandoned their true Scottish identity and have become little more than pale imitations of the hated English. They have embraced the foreign system of feudalism over the natural law of the clan. They have adopted English-style dress, English-style laws, and worst of all, an English-style language. This linguistic difference was the deepest part of the chasm. In the Highlands you spoke Gaelic, a beautiful ancient Celtic tongue closely related to Irish. It was the language of your ancestors, the language of the great bards, whose epic poems chronicled your clan's history and glory. It was the language of your identity. The Lowlanders, meanwhile, spoke Scots, a Germanic dialect that to a Gaelic ear sounded far too much like the language of the English invaders. This was not just a difference in accent. It was a fundamental barrier to communication. To a lowland merchant, Gaelic was incomprehensible gibberish. To a Highland clansman, Scots was the harsh, guttural language of the tax collector, the condescending laird, and the foreign king. It was the language of oppression. This profound divide, this mutual antipathy, created a nation that was constantly at war, not just with its neighbors, but with itself, a weakness that its kings and its enemies would learn to exploit with devastating precision. As the political center of gravity in Scotland shifted decisively towards the lowlands, and the power of the Stuart monarchy grew more centralized and ambitious, this deep cultural chasm ceased to be a mere fact of life. It became a political problem to be solved. The deep-seated prejudice of the lowland Scot was now codified into the official policy of the state. From the perspective of the king and his court at Stirling or Edinburgh, the Gaelic Highlands were not just a backward and barbarous region. They were a source of instability, a breeding ground for rebellion, and a fundamental obstacle to the creation of a modern, unified, and governable kingdom. The solution, therefore, was not to bridge the divide, but to erase one side of it. A long, slow, and deliberate war of cultural eradication was about to begin. The Stuart kings and their lowland advisors increasingly came to view the Gaelic language itself as the very root of the problem. To them, it was the language of subversion and savagery. It was the tongue in which the bards recited their seditious genealogies, reminding the clans of their power and their ancient grievances against the crown. It was the language in which chiefs plotted their rebellions, secure in the knowledge that no lowland spy could understand them. To control the Highlands, they believed they must first kill the language. This led to a series of policies aimed at the systematic suppression and eventual replacement of Gaelic with Scots, and increasingly with English. The most comprehensive and insidious of these attempts was the set of laws known as the Statutes of Iona. Enacted in 1609 and reinforced in 1616, these were not simply laws. They were a blueprint for cultural engineering. The statutes cleverly targeted the very pillars of the Gaelic world. Most famously, they compelled every Highland chief and major landholder to send their eldest son, the heir, to be educated in a lowland school. Imagine the devastating effectiveness of this policy. You take the next generation of leaders away from their homes, their culture, and their language at a formative age. You immerse them in lowland society. You teach them to read and write in English. You instruct them in the doctrines of the Protestant Kirk, and you train them to think of themselves not as patriarchal Gaelic chiefs, but as modern, respectable, rent-collecting landlords. You were in essence reprogramming the elite, turning the sons of the clan against the culture of their fathers. But the statutes went further. They sought to dismantle the cultural infrastructure that supported the Gaelic world. They outlawed the traditional bards, seeing them correctly as keepers of a dangerous independent history. They placed strict limits on the size of a chief's household retinue, undermining his military power. They even attempted to regulate the amount of wine and whiskey that could be consumed at feasts, believing that the inordinate drinking of the Gaels was a primary cause of their lawlessness and disorder. Later laws echoing the same intent would mandate English-only education and specifically outlaw the use of Gaelic in any official setting. The goal was unambiguous: to systematically eradicate Highland dress, Highland music, Highland customs, and the Highland language. From the Highland perspective, this was an existential assault. It was a clear and undeniable message from the Crown. Your culture is worthless. Your language is an impediment. Your history is illegitimate, and your very identity is a threat to the state. While these measures were far from universally effective in the short term, the Highlands were too vast, too remote, and the clan system too resilient to be dismantled by royal decree alone. They marked the beginning of a long, slow decline. They chipped away at the status of Gaelic, fostering a sense of cultural oppression and planting the seeds of an inferiority complex that would have lasting consequences for generations of Gaelic speakers. It was a calculated attempt to build a nation by burying half of its soul. If the Stuart kings needed a single powerful symbol of everything they feared and resented about the Gaelic world, they needed to look no further than the vast sea-girt domain of the Lord of the Isles. This was not merely another powerful clan chiefdom. For centuries, this formidable line of Gaelic princes, the chiefs of Clan Donald, had carved out a sprawling semi-autonomous kingdom in the Hebrides and along the western coast. From their political center at Finlagan Castle on the Isle of Islay, they ruled a realm of sea and sky, of rugged islands and deep lochs, acting less like subjects of the Scottish crown and more like sovereign monarchs in their own right. Imagine a kingdom within a kingdom, one that operated on its own terms, according to its own ancient laws and customs. The Lord of the Isles maintained his own court, presided over his own council of chieftains, and commanded his own formidable fleet of burlins, the swift clinker-built galleys that were the key to power in this maritime domain. He waged war against rival clans, brokered treaties, and most gallingly for the kings in Edinburgh, conducted his own independent diplomacy. At times, the Lord of the Isles entered into alliances directly with the King of England, a move that was seen by the Scottish crown as nothing short of high treason. This was the ultimate expression of Gaelic independence, a direct and potent challenge to the very idea of a unified Scotland under Stuart rule. This simmering tension was destined to boil over. The man who would bring this long standoff to its dramatic climax was John MacDonald II, the fourth and final Lord of the Isles to hold the old power. Ambitious and perhaps overconfident in his strength, John MacDonald launched a significant rebellion against King James III in 1462, entering into a secret treaty with England to carve up Scotland between them. But his grand ambitions outstripped his power. His forces were eventually defeated near Inverness, and the enraged King James III retaliated. He stripped MacDonald of some of his most important titles and lands, beginning the process of taking direct royal control over the vast territories of the Isles. The final blow came a generation later, after yet another rebellion was quashed by the more vigorous King James IV. The hammer fell for good. In 1493, the Lordship of the Isles was declared forfeit and permanently annexed to the Scottish crown. This was a monumental turning point, the culmination of the crown's centuries-long effort to subdue the power of Gaeldom and bring the Wild West under its direct authority. The fall of the Lordship was the end of an era, the breaking of the last great independent Gaelic power in Scotland. However, to assume that this legal act magically solved the Highland problem for the kings would be a profound miscalculation. The crown had decapitated the beast, but the body still twitched with a fierce and unruly life. The Highlands' greatest defenses were not castles or armies, but geography and culture. The region's remoteness, its rugged, unforgiving terrain, and most importantly, the fierce, ingrained loyalty of the clans to their own chiefs, continued to stymie full royal control for generations to come. A perfect illustration of this reality came in 1540. King James V, determined to make his authority felt, assembled a great naval fleet and sailed up the west coast on a grand tour of intimidation. He sailed from island to island, glen to glen, summoning the great chiefs to his ship to personally swear their allegiance and submit to his rule. On the surface, it was a resounding success, a powerful display of royal might that yielded the required oaths of fealty. But it was a hollow victory. The chiefs submitted because they had no choice with the king's cannons pointed at their homes. The moment the royal fleet disappeared over the horizon, the old ways snapped back into place. The feuds, the raids, the ancient loyalties to kin over king. All of it resumed as if the king had never been there. It was a powerful lesson in the limits of coercive action against a deeply rooted culture that the kings in their lowland courts scarcely understood. They could demand obedience, but they could not command belief. And yet, for all the deep-seated prejudice, the royal policies of suppression, and the very real cultural chasm that divided the nation, the Highlands and the Lowlands were not two hermetically sealed worlds. They could not be. Despite the mutual antipathy and the condescending efforts of the crown to anglicize the clans, a constant grudging and utterly essential process of intermingling was always taking place. Necessity, as it so often does, proved to be a more powerful force than prejudice. The two halves of Scotland, whether they liked it or not, needed each other. The most vital and powerful link between these two disparate worlds was a single, immensely valuable commodity: cattle. Specifically, the hardy black-hided cattle of the Highlands. This was the famous black cattle trade, and it was the absolute mainstay of the Highland economy. In a world with little hard currency, cattle were wealth on the hoof. They were mobile assets, a living bank account that could be driven hundreds of miles to market. Each year, vast herds of these beasts were gathered from across the glens and islands, assembled by drovers who were masters of their craft. Imagine the sight. A slow black river of thousands of cattle flowing down from the mountains along ancient drove roads, muddy, winding tracks that snaked through treacherous passes and across rain-swollen rivers. The air would be filled with the lowing of the beasts, the sharp whistles and Gaelic shouts of the drovers, and the barking of their intelligent dogs. It was a colossal feat of logistics and endurance, a journey that could take weeks. This river of wealth flowed south to the great trysts, the enormous open-air markets held at strategic locations on the Highland-Lowland frontier, like Crieff Falkirk and later Inverness. These trysts were extraordinary melting pots, chaotic, vibrant places where the two Scotlands collided. Here, the Gaelic-speaking Highland drovers, clad in their weathered plaids, their faces etched by the wind and rain, would meet the shrewd Scots-speaking lowland buyers. A cacophony of commerce would fill the air as they haggled over prices, their languages a testament to the cultural divide, but their purpose a symbol of their mutual dependency. By the 16th century, this trade had reached an industrial scale, with some estimates suggesting as many as 100,000 head of cattle making the long journey south each year. The lowland burghs and lairds reaped great profits, fattening the Highland cattle on their richer pastures before selling them on to the growing cities or for export. And the trade flowed both ways. The drovers did not return north with empty hands. They came back with goods that were scarce in the Highlands' fine cloth from the lowland weavers, salt for preserving meat, French wine and strong ale, and most importantly, metal wares, pots, tools, and weapons. This economic interdependence was sometimes mirrored at the highest social levels. While often a source of conflict, marriage could also be a tool for peace. Intermarriage between the sons and daughters of prominent Highland and Lowland families was a well-established diplomatic strategy. A carefully arranged match could serve to cement a political alliance, or more hopefully bring a final lasting end to a bitter feud. Even the kings occasionally tried to play peacemaker. King James IV, for example, was known for attempting to personally orchestrate such matches, hoping to weave the troublesome Highland elites into the fabric of lowland society through the bonds of matrimony. It was a softer, more subtle form of control than fire and sword, a recognition that while you might not be able to conquer the Highlanders, you could perhaps marry them into submission. The internal fractures of medieval Scotland, the feuds, the cultural divides, the constant jockeying for power, created a realm that was perpetually volatile and often weak. And this weakness did not go unnoticed by its larger, wealthier, and more aggressively ambitious southern neighbor. For centuries, the kings of England had cast a covetous eye northward. They saw Scotland not as a sovereign kingdom, but as a wild and untamed frontier, a rebellious northern territory that rightfully belonged under their dominion. This long-standing ambition would finally be unleashed with catastrophic force at the end of the 13th century, plunging Scotland into a century-long struggle for its very existence, a period of bloodshed and resistance that would become known as the Wars of Independence. The catalyst for this cataclysm was a succession crisis in Scotland, but the architect of the invasion was one of the most formidable and ruthless monarchs of the medieval age, King Edward I of England. Known as Longshanks for his towering, intimidating height, Edward was a brilliant military strategist, a shrewd administrator, and a man possessed by an unshakable belief in his own right to rule all of Britain. When the Scottish throne fell vacant, Edward inserted himself as the arbiter, the man who would decide which of the Scottish claimants had the strongest case. It was a clever trap. He forced the Scottish nobility to acknowledge him as their overlord, their feudal superior as a precondition for his judgment. When he eventually chose John Balliol as the new King of Scots, it was with the clear understanding that Balliol was his vassal, his puppet. This state of affairs could not last. Edward's constant demands and humiliations pushed the Scottish nobles to their breaking point. In 1296, their patience finally snapped. King John renounced his fealty, and in response, Edward unleashed the full terrifying might of the English war machine. This was not a border skirmish. It was a brutal, full-scale invasion, a campaign of conquest designed to crush Scotland into submission once and for all. Edward's armies, disciplined, well-equipped, and battle-hardened, swept across the border like a plague. They laid waste to towns and villages, putting entire populations to the sword in a calculated display of shocking brutality designed to terrorize any who might consider resistance. The Scots, disunited and caught off guard, were quickly and utterly overwhelmed. Their king, John Balliol, was captured. In a final humiliating ritual, he was publicly stripped of his royal regalia, earning him the unfortunate nickname Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat. He was forced to abdicate, and Scotland was effectively erased as an independent kingdom. It was now a conquered province of England. Edward placed the country under military occupation, appointing English governors and sheriffs to rule the land and enforce his foreign laws. The sacred stone of Scone, the ancient stone upon which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries, was seized from its abbey and carted off to London to be placed under the English throne in Westminster Abbey, a powerful symbolic act of national castration. For the common folk, this was a catastrophe. Their lairds had been forced to swear allegiance to a foreign king. English soldiers now patrolled their towns and garrisoned their castles. The already heavy burden of rent and tithes was now compounded by the demands of the occupying army. Your crops and livestock could be seized at any moment to feed the English garrisons. Your home could be burned to the ground on the mere suspicion that you had aided the fledgling resistance. It was a period of profound national humiliation and deep personal suffering. Scotland as a nation had been brought to its knees, its pride shattered, its people subjugated. But in the quiet corners of the occupied land in the forests and the hills, the embers of resentment were beginning to glow. In the years that followed the English invasion, as the grip of the occupation tightened, those embers of resentment began to glow with a dangerous heat. From this crucible of national despair and personal suffering, a new kind of leader would emerge. He was not a great lord or a claimant to the throne. He was a man of the lesser gentry, a knight from Renfrewshire named William Wallace. In him, the simmering rage of a conquered people would find its voice and its sword. Wallace was a man of humble origins, but fierce, unbending convictions. His rebellion was fueled not by political ambition, but by a deep, visceral love for his country and a burning personal hatred for the invaders who had oppressed it. The stories woven into legend say that his own wife was murdered by English soldiers, that his own home was burned. Whether this is literal truth or allegorical myth, it speaks to a deeper reality. His fight was born from the suffering that was being inflicted upon countless ordinary Scots. Wallace was not a general who commanded great armies in pitched battles. he was a master of the new brutal reality of warfare, the guerrilla campaign. He rallied the common Scots to his banner, not knights in shining armor, but farmers, woodsmen, and villagers. With this motley but determined force, he became a phantom menace to the English occupation. Striking from the shadows of the forests and the shelter of the hills, he led a series of daring raids and audacious ambushes against English supply lines, tax collectors, and isolated outposts. He turned the landscape of Scotland itself into a weapon, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to appear, strike, and vanish before the heavily armed and less mobile English forces could react. He was waging a war of 1,000 cuts, bleeding the occupation, sowing fear and confusion, and most importantly, rekindling a flicker of hope in the hearts of his countrymen. His campaign of insurgency reached its stunning zenith in September of 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Here Wallace and his co-commander Andrew de Moray faced a formidable English army confident and dismissive of the peasant rabble that opposed them. The key to the battlefield was a long, narrow wooden bridge crossing the River Forth. The English commanders, in a display of profound arrogance, began to send their heavy cavalry and infantry across the bridge 2 by 2. Wallace waited. He held his forces back with iron discipline until a significant portion of the English army was trapped on the northern side, their advance slowed to a crawl by the soft, marshy ground. Then he gave the order to attack. The Scots spearmen charged down from the high ground, cutting off the head of the bridge and surrounding the trapped English forces. The narrow crossing, which should have been their strength, became a deadly funnel. The result was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The overconfident English army was annihilated, their knights helpless as they were pulled from their horses and dispatched in the mud. The victory at Stirling Bridge was a seismic event. It transformed William Wallace from a troublesome rebel into the guardian of Scotland, the de facto leader of the nation. His exploits made him a hero, a living symbol of resistance against seemingly impossible odds. But his triumph was tragically short-lived. The following year, in 1298, a vengeful King Edward I marched north at the head of a massive new army. At the Battle of Falkirk, Wallace's spearmen, though valiant, were decimated by a weapon they had never faced before, the devastating power of the English longbow. His forces were scattered, his reputation tarnished by defeat. Wallace spent the next 7 years as a fugitive, evading capture while continuing to fight for Scotland's cause, even traveling to France to plead for aid. But his luck ran out. In 1305, he was betrayed by a Scottish noble, John de Menteith, and handed over to Edward's men. He was taken to London in chains and subjected to a mockery of a trial for treason, a charge he famously rejected, stating he could not be a traitor to a king to whom he had never sworn allegiance. His sentence was preordained, and his death on August 23rd was designed as a gruesome public spectacle. He was dragged through the streets of London on a wooden hurdle, then hanged until almost dead, disemboweled while still alive, and finally beheaded and cut into 4 pieces. His head was mounted on a spike on London Bridge, his limbs sent to the 4 corners of his homeland as a chilling warning. But Edward's brutal message backfired. In death, Wallace became more powerful than he had ever been in life. His sacrifice was not a warning. It was an inspiration, a martyr's legend that would fuel the fight for freedom for generations to come. The gruesome theatrical execution of William Wallace was intended to be the final bloody punctuation mark on the story of Scottish resistance. It was meant to extinguish the last embers of hope. But a fire once truly lit is not so easily put out. The torch of rebellion dropped from Wallace's lifeless hand would be picked up by another. This time, however, it would not be a commoner but a man from the very heart of the Scottish nobility, Robert the Bruce. Bruce was a shrewd, ambitious, and complicated figure, a man who had played both sides of the political fence. But in 1306, in a moment of decisive, brutal action, he murdered his chief rival to the Scottish throne inside a church, and had himself crowned King of Scots, an audacious act of defiance against the might of England. For years, Bruce fought a desperate guerrilla war, much like Wallace before him, hunted through the Highlands. His forces scattered his cause, seemingly hopeless. But he persevered slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding his strength, winning back castles, and rallying the fractured clans to his banner. By 1314, the stage was set for the ultimate confrontation. The English, now under the less formidable King Edward II, marched north with a gargantuan army, one of the largest ever to invade Scotland, determined to crush Bruce's rebellion and relieve the siege of Stirling Castle once and for all. Bruce, with a much smaller, less equipped force, knew he could not win a conventional battle. He had to choose his ground, and he had to be smarter. He found his ground near the Bannockburn, a small stream south of Stirling, and he had a secret weapon, an evolution of the very tactic that had failed at Falkirk. This was the schiltron. Imagine not just a line of men with spears, but a dense, tightly packed mobile formation, a living, breathing fortress of men and steel. Picture a bristling hedgehog of deadly 12-foot-long iron-tipped spears angled outwards in a virtually impenetrable wall of sharpened points. To stand inside one would be to be part of a terrifying claustrophobic community of purpose, the points of your comrades' spears just inches from your face, the collective breathing of the men around you, a single steady rhythm of resolve. This was Bruce's answer to the unstoppable force of the English heavy cavalry. As the battle began, the English knights, supremely confident in their numbers and the quality of their armor, charged forward in a thunderous wave, certain they would smash this peasant army in a single glorious assault. But as they crashed against the Scottish lines, a terrible shock awaited them. The schiltrons held. They did not break. They did not bend. The charge was stopped dead, the knights impaled on the wall of spears, their horses screaming and falling, creating a gruesome, chaotic barrier of dead and dying men and animals. The din was unimaginable. The shriek of war horns, the clash of steel on steel, the guttural shouts of men, and the screams of the wounded. The battle raged for hours, a brutal grinding contest of endurance and will. In the end, it was the discipline and raw courage of the Scots fighting for their homes and their very freedom on ground they had carefully chosen that proved decisive. The mighty English army broke and fled in a humiliating rout. Bannockburn was more than just a military victory. It was the birth of a nation's self-belief. It proved that the Scots, when united, could defeat their powerful neighbor. But the war was not over. 6 years later, in 1320, the Scottish nobles sent a letter to the Pope, a document that would become one of the most famous and eloquent assertions of national identity in history, the Declaration of Arbroath. In it, they laid out their case for independence, culminating in a stirring, defiant passage that still resonates today. For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. Yet this glorious freedom came at an almost unimaginable price. For all the poetry of the Declaration and the triumph of Bannockburn, the reality on the ground was one of utter devastation. Decades of relentless warfare had left the country a ruin. Across Scotland, the land lay fallow and deserted, the soil stained red with the blood of countless battles and skirmishes. Entire clans had been wiped out, their lines extinguished forever. Villages had been put to the torch so many times, they were little more than blackened scars on the landscape. And thousands upon thousands of ordinary people, their farms destroyed and their food seized, were left to starve in the gutted fields. Scotland would bear the deep traumatic scars of its fight for freedom for generations. The nation that emerged from the crucible of the wars of independence was a land forged in fire and blood, a kingdom that had purchased its freedom at a terrible cost. It was a place profoundly scarred, exhausted, and impoverished. And just as it began the slow, arduous process of binding its wounds and rebuilding from the man-made devastation of war, a new and even more terrifying horseman of the apocalypse arrived. This was not an invading army with banners and trumpets. This was a silent, invisible, and utterly indiscriminate killer. In the year 1350, a horrific specter that had already draped much of Europe in a black shroud of death finally crept ashore in Scotland. It was the Black Death. It arrived, as it so often did not, with a declaration of war, but in the quiet, mundane course of commerce. It slithered into the port towns aboard trading ships, a stowaway in the blood of the black rats that scurried in their holds and the fleas that infested their fur. From these coastal footholds, it began to cut a grisly, inexorable swath through the populace. The contemporary Scottish chronicler John of Fordoun painted a chilling picture of a society seized by a terror beyond comprehension. He wrote that a great multitude of men died in that first onslaught, and that the fear was so palpable that scarcely anyone dared go out of doors for fear of catching the disease. The very air seemed poisoned. Social bonds, the bedrock of the clan and community, dissolved in an acid of fear. A home once a sanctuary became a tomb. As Fordoun noted with grim finality, whenever it entered a house, it commonly carried off all the inhabitants. No one was safe. The plague was the ultimate terrifying equalizer. It did not care if you were a Campbell or a MacDonald, a powerful laird or a humble cotter. It swept through the crowded, unsanitary closes of the towns and the isolated, smoky hovels of the glens with the same ghastly impartiality. In some places, entire families were simply wiped out their bodies, left to putrefy in their homes, until the stench became unbearable. The dead were so numerous that the old ways of burial became impossible. There was no time for individual graves or proper funereal rites. Bodies were piled high in the streets on death carts, then tipped unceremoniously into vast, hastily dug mass graves, pits that swallowed the mounting corpses with a grim, anonymous finality. And for the sick, their final days were an agony of both body and soul. The moment the telltale symptoms appeared, you were shunned. Your family, your neighbors, your friends, all would recoil in terror. You were left to die alone, your pleas for a cup of water or a comforting hand going unanswered. The physical suffering was grotesque. It often began with a fever and aching limbs, but soon the horrifying signature of the disease would appear: the buboes. These were hard, painful swellings the size of an egg or a small apple that erupted in the lymph nodes of the armpits, neck, and groin. As the disease progressed, these lumps would turn a dark, bruised purple, almost black, giving the pestilence its dreadful name. Your skin would become mottled, and marked with dark patches as gangrene set in, and in the final agonizing stages, it was common to vomit black blood as your internal organs failed. This was not a gentle fading away, it was a violent, foul, and terrifying end. In the face of such an incomprehensible and unstoppable force, human society began to fracture. Panic and superstition ran rampant as people desperately sought a reason for the cataclysm that had befallen them. For most, the plague was not a biological event. It was a clear and terrifying sign of God's wrath, a divine punishment for the sins of mankind. This belief gave rise to desperate, extreme acts of piety. Bands of flagellants appeared roaming the countryside in long, grim processions. Imagine the sight. Men stripped to the waist, their backs already raw and bloody, whipping themselves and each other with leather scourges tipped with iron, their moans and chants a chilling soundtrack to the apocalypse. They believed that by inflicting this pain upon themselves, they could atone for the wickedness of the world and perhaps turn away the anger of God. But for every person who turned to extreme piety, another turned to desperate pragmatism. The horrors of the plague were perhaps most viscerally felt in the chillingly rational, if medically useless, protocols that were implemented to try and contain its spread. As soon as an infection was detected in a household, the authorities would act. The afflicted person, along with their entire family, healthy or not, would be sealed inside their own home. Imagine the terror of that moment, the heavy wooden door being barred from the outside, the windows nailed shut. A large white or black cross would be painted on the door, a stark warning to all who passed by. You were entombed alive, left to perish with your loved ones, your healthy children condemned to die alongside their ailing parents. Guards were often posted to prevent anyone from escaping this domestic prison. After a period of time when silence had fallen, the home of the dead would be burned to the ground, all their worldly possessions consumed by fire in a futile attempt to purify the land of the plague's taint. By the time the worst of the initial outbreak had passed, Scotland had lost nearly a third of its entire population. The economic and social disruption was profound. Entire villages were depopulated. Fields lay fallow for want of hands to tend them, and cattle wandered unherded through the glens. The clergy who ministered to the sick and dying were hit especially hard, leaving many parishes without priests to perform the crucial rites that people so desperately craved. But this cataclysm of death held a perverse silver lining for those who survived. With so many laborers felled, the value of those who remained skyrocketed. Landlords desperate for tenants to work their fields were forced to offer better terms. Wages for skilled and unskilled labor rose dramatically. The rigid bonds of serfdom began to weaken as peasants found they had newfound leverage and mobility. In some regions, over half the land changed hands as survivors inherited the holdings of deceased relatives, creating a sudden and dramatic shift in the social landscape. The plague also ignited a morbid piety and a deep cultural obsession with mortality. The ever-present specter of a sudden gruesome death led to the rise of the haunting artistic motif of the danse macabre, the dance of death, which depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life, kings, bishops, merchants, and peasants alike, in a final grim procession to the grave. It was a stark reminder that death was the ultimate equalizer. People prepared for the worst by meticulously drawing up their wills, often bequeathing what little money they had for prayers to be said to speed their souls through the terrors of purgatory. The psychological scars were indelible, ushering in an age of disillusionment and fear where life was seen as a precious, flickering thing. The memory of the foul death as it was called, became woven into the fabric of Scottish folklore with place names like Sick Man's Acre and Windy Gal's Plague Pits, dotting the countryside, somber monuments to an unimaginable trauma. Wind down, and so our long journey through the brutal, unforgiving, and resilient world of medieval Scotland comes to a quiet close. The clamor of the battlefield, the desperate prayers in the face of plague, and the grinding toil of daily life now begin to fade like echoes in a distant glen. Let the figures we have met tonight, the fierce clan chief, the downtrodden peasant, the defiant warrior, the grieving mother recede back into the mists of time from whence they came. Their struggles were real, their pain was profound, and their endurance was nothing short of extraordinary. But their world is not your world. The cold, damp earth of the hovel floor gives way to the softness and warmth of your bed. The gnawing hunger they knew is a feeling you are blessedly spared. The constant visceral fear of violence or disease is replaced by the peace and security of your own quiet room. All of their hardship, their unceasing struggle simply to survive another day, serves only to highlight the profound comfort that surrounds you now. Feel the gentle weight of your blankets, a luxury beyond their wildest dreams. Listen not for the blare of a war horn, but for the steady, quiet rhythm of your own breathing. Their story is told. Their fight is done. All that is asked of you now is to let go. Let go of the day. Let go of your thoughts, and allow the darkness to be a comforting embrace. There are no more fields to plow, no more battles to fight. Now it is simply time for your own quiet peace, your own deep and restorative sleep.